Hi, everyone. It's Kelly from The Hub, here today with Angela, of course, from CAP. She is on their domestic violence team, and she has been with us for several weeks, teaching us about all the parts of domestic violence so that we can be smarter, of course, in this time of COVID and beyond about all the stuff that's going on. Hello there, dear. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Kelly?
I'm doing all right, doing all right. So today our conversation is about what is the impact that domestic violence has on the victims. And of course, a lot of people are the instant answer is we're thinking about the female partner. But
Right.
of course, this can be the male partner. This could be all the children who are in the house. So there's a lot of impacts on a lot of different victims. So start us off.
So yes, it can be, most victims are women in heterosexual relationships. But victims come in all shapes and sizes and colors, just like everything else. So same-sex partners, male victims, we don't discount that. It's the research shows us that women are still primarily the population that's going to be most impacted as victims. So there's some research that tells us that 1 in 3 women around the world will be abused, sexually assaulted, and even murdered in their lifetime. So that's a really startling statistic when you think about it, just because that's a very large number of people, and because women are the larger portion of the population, and yet we still kind of want to tuck it away, right? We don't want to talk so much about domestic violence or about the neighbors that are really loud. And I really appreciate the series that we're doing and that you're willing to bring this out to the open to folks, because we can't keep it in the shadows. We can't keep hiding it. And it's not just the physical abuse that people typically expect to see. Abusers are pretty good at choosing their tactics, and if they're using physical abuse, they're oftentimes going to abuse someone where the bruises can't be easily seen. If you think about it, though, it's August and it's 90 degrees out. Seeing somebody walking around in a long sleeve shirt could be, maybe they just are cold, but it could also be that they're trying to cover up some marks or bruises. And oftentimes it'll look like fingerprints or, somebody grabbing their arm and twisting their arm or something like that. But physical abuse is not the most common, I think. It's what we commonly think of. So,
right. And we've brought this up several times. TV shows us,
right.
Because if you don't know it from a study or learning this or being a part of this, you learn your stuff from TV. So TV shows us that you're right. You hide your bruises, and that people get hit a lot.
Right. So if you think back to the lethality assessment conversation that we had, the first incident of physical violence was actually possibly strangulation. And that was the only example of physical violence that was on that questionnaire. Everything else was a threat or a belief that something was going to happen. There was stalking behavior on there. So the reason why that lethality assessment program is so important is because I don't have the number in front of me, but the first physical incident of violence was actually their homicide. I don't remember what the percentage is, but I want to say it was it was right around 50% or just a little less. And that's enough for us to kind of throw some of our old training out to say, okay, we have new information. We have new evidence that tells us that we have to move beyond this focus on physical violence, and that these other forms of violence are equally or even more dangerous. So having, the presence of a weapon or a gun in the house and making threats to use that, that is dangerous for a victim.
Right.
So that's a psychological terror, right?
Yeah.
Like that's what the abuser is doing, is getting inside of the victim's head and saying, I can take your life at any time. And we know during COVID, I was on a webinar early on, and they were saying that right now, the number of gun permits, people applying for guns, is at an all-time high. It's the highest it's ever been since they started tracking in the database in 1999. So we're talking 20 years, all-time high gun sales, gun permits. That is concerning for me.
Right.
Some of the other impacts on victims that we don't always see or hear, we might see some examples of like male privilege or gender privilege. So it might be that they're acting in very gendered roles within the household. And it's not to say that traditional family values, whatever that is defined as anymore. I'm not even sure what that term really means.
Right.
I think it's a white middle class standard, right?
Yeah.
But I wouldn't, I don't know that that's really true anymore.
Yeah.
But so very gendered roles. The victim doesn't have any say in the decisions about the family, about the children, about the finances. Even in same-sex relationships, they might be forced into some kind of stereotypical gender role based on the abuser's preference. We also know that, making threats to out their partner, if they are not out to friends and family, can be a form of control and manipulation in a relationship. So they start to weave together these threats, and the coercion that goes along with that. So it's not always so easily seen from the outside, which is some of what we talked about, I think the week that we were talking about, like how to help a friend.
Yeah.
Don't make assumptions and don't go in,
right.
Like the hero on the horse. Let the victim lead.
Yeah.
Minimizing, blaming the victim. So they might blame the victim for what's happening. And so then the victim starts to internalize that, right? And they start to believe that the abuse is their fault, that they are the catalyst causing the abuse.
Right. If they did more fill in the blank, they would no longer be abused. So,
right.
So that it's your fault. So if you try harder to make your abuser not get mad, then they won't. That's
right.
Yeah.
So they might start to accept the abuse, the put downs,
because they deserve it, because they couldn't fulfill that high expectation, whether that's appropriate or not. They couldn't fulfill that, so therefore they deserve this punishment, whether it's psychological or physical.
Yes. And so it starts to become a mental game, really, because I'm going to speak for me, but I'm guessing that there's lots of women, especially women, probably men too, who get like this loop that we think about ourselves and we talk to ourselves, and and some days it's I'm really accomplished, I'm pretty, I'm proud of who I am, and other days it's like I'm not good at anything, I'm like we have those days, right? And so what happens is, I think with victims, is that they get that negative self-talk loop that's been infiltrated by the abuser. You're no good, nobody else will want you, you're a bad mother, you can't even get yourself to work on time. Like, so all of those negative messages, I think, start to become part of that internal dialogue, which then they start to believe, right? It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right, and in order to get out of that, you have to be really strong. I mean, really strong, and depending on your personality, you might have to talk it out or write it out or do something to let those feelings go. But if you can't, you're right. Then you're stuck in that loop, and you almost can't get out, because
Right.
you're going around and around. See, and then everything that happens, you drop a cup. See, that's because he was right. I
Yeah.
really am a bad mom.
Yeah.
See, I didn't get the laundry done in fast enough. I didn't make dinner wasn't as good as he wanted. So see, he's right.
Right.
And then it just goes on and on and on. And so, right. So, right, you are spiraling out of control, and the abuser's like, cha-ching, win, cha-ching, win. I mean, every time. Yeah.
And
Oh boy, this
and
is
so yeah, so if they don't have, what makes it worse then is if they don't have a support system, if they don't have friends or family who are around them who are countering the abuse with just loving them as a friend or a family member, supporting them, encouraging them, just, another worldview, because now the victim is living according to this worldview that the abuser has created. And we could, talk more about gaslighting if you want. We could spend a whole morning on that. But so now, if they don't have those friends and family, because that's often part of the abuse, is cutting off the support system.
Yeah.
Whether it's intentional or not, it could be as blatant as the abuser saying, I don't like your sister, she's got an attitude, she's not welcome here in our house anymore. So now the impact on the victim is that she is forced to choose between her partner and her sister, and then maybe having to skillfully find ways to see her sister outside of the house, right?
Right.
So, or the abuser is just a jerk and nobody wants to be around them anymore. And so friends start to make excuses about not wanting to come over and visit anymore, or, let's do something else somewhere else. But then the abuser gets mad that the victim is leaving the house because the abuser wants to control the victim and what they're doing. And, well, why do you have to go see them outside of the house? They used to come here all the time.
Right.
But the abuser has the ability to cut off the support system of the victim. And if that's their only real soundboard and connection to reality and support and love to counterbalance all of the mental and emotional abuse that's going on, it becomes even more difficult to rebound out of that, like you said.
Right.
And so the victims who I've worked with have told me flat out, it really is the mental and emotional abuse that's much harder to get over, to get through, to work through, because everything is internalized. That negative self-talk loop then starts to take root in their self-esteem and their belief in themselves. So they start to see themselves as unworthy and undeserving. And what happens then, like, people start to just give up, right? Like, this is the lot in life that I've been handed. And if they come from one of those places with traditional values, that this is the partner you signed on for life,
right,
regardless of whether they treat you well or not.
Right.
But this is the person you've signed on for life, so just suck it up.
Right. And I can hear some people saying, well, then maybe you need to work harder so your partner respects you more. Maybe maybe you need to clean a little better. Maybe you need to figure out how to make better food.
Right.
So that you could understand that the victim could also be victimized by some of their people on the outside.
Mm-hmm. It also becomes challenging then when they look around, when the victim might finally start to realize that something isn't quite right, and here's the other thing, is that this happens gradually over time, right, most of the time, right? It's not like, boom, you're there. There may not be a lot of other relationships to compare that to. Maybe they saw some of these things happening in their parents' relationships as a child. So there's some normalization of it. And so how much is normal? How much should we expect to experience in our relationships that is abusive? So there's also that conditioning, that socialization component. So when they do pick their head up and they start to look around, the community doesn't want to talk about it. The community doesn't want to acknowledge that domestic violence is here, that dating abuse is happening to our teenagers in the high schools. Like, the community, if the community isn't willing to say with open arms, we are here to support you, how do they know where to go? Like,
Right.
and the research shows us, again, going back to the lethality research, 96% of victims who were killed had not contacted the free and local program like DVS in their community.
Right. Because if you don't believe it, or if you believe that hitting makes it abuse, or physical violence makes it abuse, then you say, well, this isn't what's happening. And this happened with my parents. That's how my dad treated my mom, or however that worked in your family. So then you say, well, then it's not. You're right. This is what marriage is. Because it's not like we've all been married 27 times and we just go, right? So you go, oh, well, this is how marriage is.
Right.
And then you use those, well, at least he's not hitting me.
Right. Absolutely.
So maybe if I just do it, I'll just do it, whatever it is.
If I just figure out how to make them happy,
then it'll be fine.
Then everything will be fine.
Yeah.
But the happiness line keeps moving, right? It's a moving target because it's never the same. Once you figure out what the favorite meal is, then you have to figure out what the proper laundry schedule is, right? Or the proper cleaning schedule, or, whatever. But
or your weight, or whatever the next thing is that becomes impossible for you to achieve.
Yes. So victims are constantly trying to live up to whatever kind, that invisible or that movable standard. So it's always an unpredictable situation. And what we know about trauma is that when we're living in those unpredictable situations where we're always on high alert because we're not sure when it's coming at us, but we know that it's going to, and if we don't have any control over that, our bodies are producing the hormones, the cortisol, the adrenaline that always kind of keeps us on high alert. And so there is some research out there that shows that victims of domestic violence have higher health implications because of that ongoing trauma that they're living in. It's similar to living in a war zone or in a community where there's a high rate of gun violence, because you never know where it's going to come from, but your body is always on alert for it to happen, for that fight or flight moment, right? And so people then start to adapt to that surrounding in that situation. So it takes root, and there's then those physical complications and results of the violence or the unhealthy relationship that they're living in, never knowing when it's going to drop.
Right.
So even though we might not see it and we might not exactly hear it all of the time, we have to assume that it's here in our community. What I talked about, the 1 in 3 around the world. We know from the research, like 1 in 3, 1 in 4 women, and I think it's 1 in 7 or 1 in 9 men experience domestic violence. So it's here in our community. And one of the later talks, I know we're going to talk more about what the community can do, but we really need to start acknowledging it and making sure that our young people are aware of this, because they can fall susceptible to it very easily in those new relationships that they have as new daters, right? New young people in relationships.
Do you have stuff, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I was thinking about social class. Mm-hmm. I think it's it's easy for a lot of people to just talk about, well, it's those people. And they have definitions of who those people are, who are generally poorer,
Yeah.
who are generally, whatever the you don't like is. And so do you know from the research that does domestic violence happen across all socioeconomic classes, or does it tilt one way or another, or how does that sort of play out? And we can certainly talk about that in the future. So I didn't want to put you on the spot. It just popped into my head.
Yeah. So, I mean, we do know that it doesn't discriminate based on social class or gender or gendered relationships,
Right. That's actually
socioeconomic
good.
status, education levels.
Yeah.
It happens across the board. I think that people who are living in situations where they already have fewer resources,
Yep.
are just barely, are surviving, right?
Yep.
So if you think about like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, safety, security, when people are operating at a basic level like that, and they are fighting to keep their home, fighting to keep the electricity on, like they're in basic survival mode. I don't know that they're necessarily paying attention to the quality of their relationships, right? Like they're really just trying to survive and to support their children.
Right.
I can tell you anecdotally, I was an advocate at the Manheim Township Police Department almost 20 years ago, from 99 to like 2003. And my role there was to follow up on the domestic violence, family violence calls that the officers responded to.
Yeah.
And it was a great model. They really appreciated having somebody, the officers really appreciated having somebody who was the social worker, right? Who would do the follow-up, who would do the touchy-feely follow-up stuff, because they didn't sign on for that.
Right, and they're not trained to do
police
that.
Officer.
Right.
They didn't sign on to be a social worker.
Right.
Very different roles.
Yeah.
And so I was able to do the follow-up, and I was busy. It was part-time, but I was busy all of the time.
Yeah.
And that's Manheim Township. And I'm sure that has not changed. I'm sure that they are still pretty busy. And they also, just from my experience, they also do take it seriously. They've had, they work to train their officers and keep their officers up to date on training. So, and maybe some of the other police departments are doing that too, and I'm not privy to that information, but I can tell you that that's been my experience with one department.
Yeah.
I think it's great that Lancaster City has the social worker, Leilani, I think her name is Leilani, who can, follow up and do that work again with folks living in the community, that frees the officers up to keep their focus on, public safety. And then she can help connect them to resources and things like that in the community. Right. I would, hopefully we can build that model out in lots of other places too.
Yeah. This has been wonderful, as always. It's every time when we meet, and I think I probably say this every time, I love learning this. I love that we can share this with people so that they can learn more about this as well. Do you want to make sure we always end with the phone number and the text line? So do you want to give that?
Sure. So we have our 24-hour hotline. We're there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all year round. 717-299-1249. And if you're not able to call us, you can initiate a text message conversation with us by texting the word SAFE, S-A-F-E, to the number 61222. So that's 61 with 3 2s.
Excellent. Thank you, Angela. We will talk again next week. It was wonderful to chat with you. See you, everybody.
Until then, have a good week.
You too.